54. So several things. I asked you to take a look at the pictures, and so why don't you open up to page 53. All the pictures in this book are significant. Oscar talked about how he printed them off the internet, and they were in the Stuff That Happened to Him book. And so every picture in here has a purpose. 53, obviously, it's the keys. When he both had copies of his house key made for everybody, and then also the quest he's on for his key. Page 54 is Stephen Hawking, the astrophysicist that he admires so much and wants to be his assistant. Page 55 is Hamlet, and when Oscar plays the role of Yorick, and if you look at that picture, Hamlet is the dude and Yorick is the skull that the dude is holding. So that's the role Oscar plays. It's a very complex role. Page 56, there's going to be a scene where Oscar and his dad are making paper airplanes. Page 57, when Stephen Hawking was having the conversation with the woman about the world is a plate stacked on a bunch of tortoises, and it looks like those two particular turtles are having a very special, tender moment. Page 58 is Jules from the family jewelry business. Page 59 is a person falling out of the world, or jumping out of the World Trade Center. Page 60 and 61 is a blank map of Central Park, and so you can see just how big that area is. And if you think back to Oscar in the beginning, when he went on that, the reconnaissance expedition that his dad sent him on, that was the area that he went to explore, which just shows you how ambitious he is and how he's willing to kind of follow any lead and any clue. Page 62 is a zoomed in picture of the person jumping from the World Trade Center. Page 63 is from the art supply store, where it was very difficult to write a color that's different than the color of the pen you're writing with. Page 64, I'm not sure we've gotten to this, but that is Leighton Hewitt, the tennis player, and Oscar thought it was interesting that it was difficult to tell whether that guy was happy or sad in that picture. Page 65, Oscar's mom had taken him to get fingerprinted. Page 66, this is, I'm assuming, kind of a meaning of life type of thing, evolutionary life. Page 67, later on we're going to hear about one of the first astronauts who returned from space, and because there was no gravity in space, all his muscles had atrophied to the point where he collapsed as soon as he got back on Earth. The gravity was too much for him. Okay, so you can kind of be questions like that as different pictures show up in the book. Taking a look at just a couple quick things. Go to page 68, because we didn't quite finish up this chapter yesterday. And this is one of Oscar's big problems. And again, I've talked a couple times about how a lot of things in this book are just kind of symbolic. They're a little bit over the top, but they're all in there for a point. I knew that I could never let Mom hear the messages from his dad. Because protecting her was one of my most important raison d'etre, which means reason to be. So that's why that's kind of the meaning of his life. So what I did was I took Dad's emergency money from on the top of his dresser, and I went to Radio Shack on Amsterdam. It was there on TV that I saw the first building had fallen. I bought the exact same phone and ran home and recorded our greeting onto the first phone onto it. I wrapped up the old phone in the scarf that Grandmother was never able to finish because of my privacy, and I put that in a grocery bag, and I put that in a box, and I put that in another box, and then I put that under a bunch of stuff in my closet, like my jewelry workbench and a bunch of albums of foreign currencies. Now, this is another kind of over-the-top example of what Oscar's done with The Secrets, and with that other characters have done too. Okay, so he takes that idea, that thing that he's sad about, or the thing he's upset about, and he buries it as deeply as he possibly can within himself. Okay, and just like he physically did with the answering machine, that's what he's emotionally doing with the problems that he has, and that's what other characters, like the man who can't speak, and various other characters that Oscar meets as he goes around trying to find who the key belongs to. And page 70, go on to the next chapter. So my feelings. This is written from Oscar's grandmother, and if you take a look at the date on the top of this, September 12th, 2003, so almost 2 years to the day after September 11th, and shortly after her son and Oscar's father was buried. And she's writing this to him from the airport, so keep that in mind. And pay attention to the dates. Oscar's grandmother, anytime she writes, it's written in kind of this pretty distinct style of writing. There's a lot of spaces in between different sentences. She doesn't indent any paragraphs, things like that. Go to page 76. So when she gets this letter, a letter was sent to her house from a Turkish labor prison. And it says, I took the letter straight to my room. I put it under my mattress. I never told my father or mother about it. For weeks I was awake all night wondering, why was this man sent to a Turkish labor camp? Why had the letter come 15 years after it had been written? Where had it been for those 15 years? Why hadn't anyone written back to him? The others got mail, he said. Why he had sent a letter to our house? How did he know the name of my street? How did he know of Dresden? Where did he learn German? What became of him? I tried to learn as much about the man as I could from the letter. The words were very simple. Bread only means bread. Mail is mail. Great hopes are great hopes are great hopes. I was left with the handwriting. And so what she did, is she tried to get as many letters from various people as she can to try to compare the handwriting of others to this guy and hopefully determine who this guy is. I actually had a student a couple of years ago who decided to do a similar assignment and asked as many people as she knew, teachers, friends, family members, to write her a letter. And I think she really seemed to enjoy it and said she got a lot out of it and got some really interesting letters, particularly from family members. So this might be something you want to think about. If you have particularly older family members or people you don't see as much, just ask them to write you a letter. And this also relates to notice that this is something very similar to what Oscar did. Okay, so when Oscar was upset, he wrote letters, and he wrote many, many letters to as
many people as he could think of. She asked people to write letters to her. And one of the people that got the letter from, one of the people that she got a letter from was Kurt Schlichter, who was an inmate and who had killed his brother because his brother had an affair with his wife. On page 78, he continued to write letters to the board. He continued to blame himself and forgive his wife, not knowing that there was no one on the other end. My uncle took each letter and promised the inmate that they would be delivered, but instead he kept them all. They filled all of his drawers in his dresser. And remember that too, because that's going to show up later. I remember thinking, it's enough to drive someone to kill himself. I was right. My uncle, your great-great-uncle, killed himself. Of course, it's possible that the inmate had nothing to do with it. So, because this guy couldn't pass on the information and the stories that the inmate in prison passed on to him, he couldn't take it. Okay, so it's yet another example, and we get example after example after example of people being unable to express themselves and seeing the trouble that it causes them. She also asked her grandmother to write her a letter on page 79. The letter she gave me was 67 pages long. It was the story of her life. She had made my request into her own. Listen to me. I learned so much. She sang in her youth. She'd been to America as a girl. I never knew that. She'd fallen in love so many times that she began to suspect she was not falling in love at all, but doing something much more ordinary. I learned that she never learned to swim, and for that reason she always loved lakes and rivers. She asked my father, her father, my great-grandfather, your great-great-great-grandfather, to buy her a dove. Instead, he bought her a silk scarf. So she thought of the scarf as a dove. She convinced herself that it contained flight, but it did not fly because it did not want to show anyone what it really was. That was how much she loved her father. This is another thing which is going to show up a number of different times. Characters, and this is a very postmodern thing, characters basically willing to create their own reality to make the world fit as they see him. This girl loved her father so much that she basically took the present that he gave her, which was completely unlike the present she asked for, and viewed it as the present that she asked for, because it allowed her to continue to love her father and to not be angry with him. Does that make sense? It's kind of a complicated idea, but a lot of characters in this, particularly once we get to grandmother and Thomas, when they get married and they live their lives, they're going to create their own reality, basically, because the reality around them that they both lost someone that they really loved is too difficult to deal with, and they don't want to deal with it. And so they basically create reality around them as they see fit. Going on, the letter was destroyed, but its final paragraph is still inside of me. She wrote, I wish I could be a girl again, with the chance to live my life again. I've suffered so much more than I needed to, and the joys I've felt have not always been joyous. I could have lived differently. I took a class once, it was a philosophy class, and the guy said one goal you should try to strive for in your life is to try to live your life as if it's the second time around. The first time you go through your life, you're worrying about petty things, you make your mistakes, and then the second time all around, you live your life and you kind of know what life's all about, and you try to live it simply and get as much out of it as you can. Going back, she wishes she could go back and do her life over again. It would be sad to get to the end of your life and get to that point. When I was your age, my grandfather bought me a ruby bracelet. It was too big for me and would slide up and down my arm. It was almost a necklace. He later told me that he had asked the jeweler to make it that way. Its size was supposed to be a symbol of his love. More rubies, more love. But I could not wear it comfortably. I could not wear it at all. So here's the point of everything I've been trying to say to you. If I were to give you a bracelet to you now, I would measure your wrist twice. With love, your grandmother. Okay, so basically what grandmother said to Oscar is, if I was going to give you a gift, I would ask the gift that you want.
And if I was going to love you, I would ask you how you want to be loved, instead of, as her father did, buy a gigantic bracelet, which there's no way she could even wear, because that's his vision of what love is. He's not asking her. He's not talking to her about it, because if he did, that wouldn't have been the gift she would have asked for. Just as her mother wouldn't have asked for the scarf instead of the dove. So it's an instance of we need more communication. Going on a little bit, Thomas, who is a sculptor, tries to sculpt. Whoa, it got dark in here. Tries to sculpt grandmother. And on page 83, after only a few sessions, it became clear that he was sculpting Anna. He was trying to remake the girl he had knew 7 years before. He looked at me as he sculpted, but he saw her. Going on a little bit, he touched me all over, and this is on 84. I could tell you these things because I'm not ashamed of them, because I learned from them. And I trust you to understand me. You're the only one I trust, Oscar. The positioning was the sculpting. He was sculpting me. He was trying to make me so he could fall in love with me. Okay, so this is grandmother telling Oscar all these things which she could never say to him, but she could finally write into a letter. And then at the end of this conversation, we find out how they end up getting together. And this is we heard this version of this part of the story from Thomas in the restaurant, in the diner in the beginning, where he flipped back to the word help, and then so we get this. I flipped to the next blank page of his little book and wrote, "Please marry me." I'm just going to finish this in another 30 seconds. He looked at his hands, yes and no. Why does anyone ever make love? He took his pen and wrote on the next to last page, "No children." That was our first rule. I understood, and I told him in English. We never used German again. The next day, your grandfather and I were married. So their relationship is going to be one of rules. Okay? And their first rule is to not speak in their native language, because it makes it a lot easier to not talk about the things that they went through if they're both speaking in their second language, which is harder for them to communicate in. Okay? And the second rule that they made is no children. Okay? And we'll find out more about why that is as we get into the book a little bit. But their entire marriage is based on rules. And the rules are what allow them to kind of put aside the fact that the woman Thomas loved, Anna, was killed, and grandmother's sister was killed. Okay? They are really the two people in the best position to help each other, because they both have the best understanding of what actually happened. And we'll find out what happened to her a little bit later. But because they can't talk, because they can't communicate, their marriage is one where they're basically going to create their own reality. And it's not going to make a lot of sense, but it makes sense to them. Meow. Bye.